Welcome to a special series called The Global Crisis Monitor, featured on the Treasury Update podcast. Thank you for joining. On this episode of the Global Recovery Monitor series, special host Meredith Zonsius joins Craig Jeffery and Alexa Cook of Strategic Treasurer to discuss period 19 results from the COVID-19 Impact and Response Survey. With a full year's worth of data reported, they continue their discussion on the current state of recovery with a view to economic, health, and social developments. Listen in to learn the major factors impacting Treasury and finance organizations today. Welcome back to the podcast, Craig and Alexa.
Thanks, Meredith. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's good to be here. It's been a while since we've had a Global Recovery Monitor.
So we have now completed 19 survey periods in the Global Recovery Monitor series. Craig, will you start us off with some of the headlines?
Sure. One of the headlines has to do with the vaccination. We asked the question about what level of the population needed to be vaccinated before we returned to normal. And it was interesting. 3%, no matter what level of vaccination was, didn't feel we'd return to normal. When we looked at 34% felt we'd return to normal if we hit the range of 20 to 39% of the population being vaccinated. That jumped to 74% once we fell into the range of 40 to 59%. So pretty significant movements towards return to normal once we reach the 50% level of vaccinations. The other element is the positivity around vaccinations with regard to medical, economic, and social categories retreated a little bit, weren't so positive as compared to the prior period. So despite the fact that they're rolling out, that's pulled back slightly. You can see the information in the report. And finally, only about 23% were more concerned or extremely more concerned about keeping their jobs since the start of the pandemic. And somewhere around 20% were less or extremely less concerned. So it's reaching about static between those two, but on the net, we would say that it's still less positive than prior to the panic, but it seems to be returning, snapping back to normal.
Yeah, and I can touch quickly on some of those economic highlights too. So both our 3-month and our 12-month outlook have shifted positively, and this period's data is really suggesting that we've reached equilibrium since both of these time frames have reached a new peak.
In the survey, we have cycled through questions throughout the periods, one of them asking if respondents expect a net expansion or contraction of staffing in the industry. How did respondents answer this question this period?
So respondents have answered that they still believe that there will be more contraction in the staffing in the industry, and we've seen that the net contraction has increased from 4% in the prior period to about 9% in this period.
Interesting. Another question we have been cycling through is if payments to vendors and suppliers have been extended or generally stayed the same, what were some of the results this period compared to the last periods?
Yeah, that's a great question, Meredith. At the beginning of the crisis, way back at the third period, so April 1st to 8th, payments were extended significantly. This was period 3, and the net was 34% had extended their payments. And there's some details about why they were extended, whether it was because they were working from home, they're trying to conserve cash. So that net 34% extending payments is one benchmark. And as we looked at period 19, or the past 2 months, 29% had extended their payments. And this was a slight increase from period 18. And yet 10% had sped up payments over this. So the net 19% negative. So about 1 in 5 were extending their payments in this past period versus 34%. So that's a pretty good movement back towards neutrality in terms of the payment front. So we're about half the way there. We'll want to monitor and see how long it takes before that comes back to normal.
Mm-hmm. That's good news. We added a couple of new questions this period, one on Treasury and finance projects for this year. Did respondents make it clear whether projects were back on the table?
Yeah. So once we went into the crisis, or as we went into the pandemic, there was a depth of the lost month or two, or the lost quarter of projects. Many were stalled or paused. It wasn't particularly pretty. But what we've seen here in this period, as we look into the rest of 2021, there's a lot of organizations that are active on projects. It's a very healthy percentage of the respondents are active in projects with regards to payments or technology, such as different types of treasury technology and banking selection and services. So it's quite healthy. And there's still about a quarter, depending on the category that we just talked about, tech, payments, or banking selection. There's still about a quarter of organizations that are in evaluation. They're evaluating whether they're going to move forward or not. So there's some caution there. But this represents about a little bit more than 50% of those that are working on projects. So there's a potential for a really good year for those technology firms and banks. But this is pretty positive. It looks like a good runway for 2021.
Were there any changes to the top concerns from the prior period?
Sure. So from our forced rank questions, when we look at the average level, one of the things that moved the most was recessions in the regions we operate in. So that had moved from second from the top, so next to the top, to fourth on a period-over-period basis. So concern about recession seems to be receding, along with some of the health and considerations of the economy and individual company performance. The second forced rank survey, when we look at an average, civil unrest in North America, number one still, or it sits at number one. And the COVID response impact almost tied with the civil unrest issue. So that's that response impact has been number one most of the time, and that's shifted. Number three, potential changes in taxation, new administration, new stimulus, new programs, lots of spending, and potential changes in taxation has moved up to number three. So the other element there I'll talk about is the COVID death rate as a concern on average was number three last period. That's now fallen to number five. So ability to treat, herd immunity, vaccinations seems to be reducing that, and it's fallen to number five. So a number of interesting points there.
Thanks, Craig. Alexa, how are the time estimates looking for health and financial normacy?
Well, the inflection point has moved back to just over 2 months from the prior period's 3 months, which is great. And the peak death rate has decreased down to just 1 month, which I believe is the best we've seen since we started polling on this one. And then for the overall health outlook, the extension of time until COVID-19 becomes a minor health issue has actually increased from right between 9 and 10 months to about 11 months. And lastly, the financial normalcy in individual businesses has also pulled back to 10 months, which is about a month decrease from the prior period's 11 months. So really all of our measurements are looking pretty good except for the minor health issue, which is the only one that saw a slight increase.
I would just jump in there too, Meredith, on that. I think it really makes sense to look at some of these charts because a couple of them, like the health issue, the ongoing health issue and financial normalcy, there's a few areas where you can see a gap opening up in the middle time domain where there's a fair number of people that would have a very pessimistic view in terms of the impact. And so it's bunched up there, and then a fair number that would be taking the more optimistic view on the left-hand side bunching up. And some of them have a gap where there's almost no respondents in those areas. So it's looking more like a dumbbell now. And that's interesting to see the shape of the responses change in this manner. So something worth looking at the reports for.
Yeah. Each period, I typically ask you about the respondents' outlook on AR, fiscal policy, and a few other categories. Any changes on the outlooks here?
Yeah, so A majority of the outlooks that we're typically looking at were positive, and there was just a couple of the exceptions. So I'll kind of go through some of those exceptions that were net negative. So ARs cut in half down to 7% net negative. And the prior period, it was at 14% net negative. And fiscal policy actions or inactions came down to about 13% net negative, and it was 20% in the prior period. And then new to the survey last period was the cost of borrowing, which was sitting at about 2% net negative.
Before we wrap up the episode, what do we need to be thinking about for the weeks ahead?
Yeah, I think if we think about it, a couple of these are going to be obvious, and some may or may not be so obvious. The impact of the vaccine as it continues to roll out will have gained another couple of months. Will that have an impact on positivity, or will new strains influence that in a negative manner? Because we saw how that impacted both the health concerns as well as there was a social impact and an economic impact. Those are really quite interesting to us. The other is we've seen some of these economic indicators, many of them move to the most positive level they've been in a year. So seeing if these continue that trend, that'll be quite interesting, especially when we've seen some negative perceptions about tax rates happening, perhaps slowing the economy down. So there's a few areas there that we really want to pay attention to see how this impacts the overall view of the economy, individual companies, and industry. So those are the ones that we're looking at.
Thanks, Craig, for that feedback. How often will we be reporting the results of the Global Recovery Monitor series moving forward?
Yeah, so we're on a 2-month track or an 8-week cycle where the results will be released every 2 months right now for the foreseeable future.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Craig and Alexa. I look forward to our next discussion. We wanted to encourage you to take the Global Crisis Monitor survey repeatedly while it's live. It runs from Wednesday to Tuesday every week. You can go to treasurycoalition.com and follow the links. Add your voice and insight so that as a profession, we can take positive and knowledgeable steps to move our organizations and nations forward. Invest 5 minutes each week at treasurycoalition.com and get great information and insights while helping our profession and organizations.
This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.